Now we're going to look at masculinity in health and race. It's very interesting. So, that give 'em hell ideology can present risks for all men, but it also can present more or less risk for different types of men. So that's where health and race comes in here. Because class, race, and masculinity intersect very often in the arenas of work and labor. So, for example, immigrant populations in the U.S. have always, been forced to do the less desirable and often more and most dangerous jobs, um, and so there's that. An example is slaughterhouses. Uh, they have a very long history of using male immigrant labor. In the beginning, it was in Chicago primarily where the stockyards were and the slaughterhouses were, and more recently in rural Iowa. I don't know if you're aware of this. Iowa and Arkansas passed laws in 2023 that allows children as young as 14 to work in the meat coolers and industrial laundries, and teens 15 and older uh, work on assembly lines around dangerous machinery. And of course, these are all immigrant children. And the slaughterhouses are one of the main places, and the cleaning of the equipment in slaughterhouses that this law allows 14-year-olds to work overnight on night shifts, and it's one of the most dangerous part. Slaughterhouses are dangerous to begin with. The cleaning equipment is the most dangerous. So, slaughterhouses have an injury rate 3 times greater than any other kind of factory in the United States. Each year, a quarter of the men and women who work in them suffer a work-related injury that requires medical attention that's more than just first aid. In some slaughterhouses, well over 50% of the workers are Hispanic. Daily cleanup, as I said, is the most dangerous job and the most poorly paid. And as I said, that's what the new law allows 14-year-olds to do. So, working dangerous jobs is just one factor affecting the discrepancies in the health and welfare of both men of color and working class men in the United States. The life expectancy, here's another unbelievable statistic. The life expectancy for Black men living in Harlem, which is about 96% African American, who are over the age of 40. So, Black men over the age of 40 living in Harlem, their life expectancy is lower than that of men living in Bangladesh, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. As I'm sure we know from all the horrible news stories and events, being an African American male, being in an African American male body can be very dangerous because they can be viewed as dangerous as just walking down the streets, right? Uh, or going to the wrong house to pick up your, knocking on the door of the wrong house to pick up your cousin. You can be killed and shot. Uh, going into the wrong store, looking at somebody the wrong way historically, can get you killed as a Black man, as we've seen, as I've said recently. So, of course, many Black men have learned to carefully monitor their actions in situations like being pulled over by the police, and they've gotten, quote, the talk from their mom or dad, um, about how to behave with a cop, with a policeman when you're pulled over. To keep your hands visible at all times. If you're making a move to get your driver's license or your insurance card, you tell them what you're going to do first. That's part of the talk. Okay, so that masculinity itself leads to a risk-taking behavior is also another element of this, as we've seen. It's the first way in which being a man can be dangerous to yourself, this risk-taking behavior. But the second way that men tend not to seek help for their health problems. They're much more likely to, quote, suck it up and not admit that they need help. They also often fail to use behaviors, change behaviors, employ behaviors that are necessary for maintaining health. We go back to smoking again. They're more likely to stop taking their medications. For example, those for high blood pressure. At the same time, they're often under more stress for a variety of reasons. And although women suffer from more chronic diseases like, anemia and migraines, arthritis, diabetes, thyroid disease, they're not generally life-threatening diseases, especially if you take your meds. But when it comes to the most life-threatening diseases, then men take the lead over women. Okay. So this isn't a big example. The male to female ratio for heart disease as a cause for death for different age groups is dramatic. Among those 24 to 44, the ratio of male to female deaths from heart disease, I could hardly believe this when I saw it, 283 to 100. 283 men between 24 and 44 die of heart disease compared to 100 women in that age range. Men are much more likely to die much earlier from heart disease than from women. They also die at greater rates than women from every type of cancer except for breast cancer. So rather than these statistics showing that men are genetically weaker than women, a more likely explanation is the particular demands that masculinity places on men in countries like the United States. Because to admit that you're sick and to seek help for that is internalized and interpreted as a sign of weakness. Remember the be sturdy as an oak aspect of masculine hegemony. And because depression is considered a feminine disease, men are far less likely to seek help for that as well, which is what may lead to all those homicides that we just discussed. Neurodiversity, ADHD, is another area where men there's major differences in how both that manifests in males and females and how they're treated. Because males with ADHD tend, especially, young boys, tend to act out in ways that is much more disruptive than the females with ADHD do. So therefore, they're much more heavily and frequently medicated to a much greater extent than females are. Now we're going to look at some women's issues with health and health. These are important issues to me. I'll explain why as we move through them a little bit. But I'll recommend maybe I'll put up some books and some sources for you as well this week. So we're now going to look at women, doctors, midwives, and hormones. So gender, of course, is very important in how we take care of our bodies. And to the practice of medicine and healthcare, who occupies those jobs in medicine and healthcare are very important and involved in how we take care of our bodies, influencing the stories we tell about them. So here's an interesting question your text poses. What happened to people who became ill before there were doctors? Well, there were women healers. Okay, and midwives, of course, but women healers worked with everybody, but midwifery was one of their main things that they did. So you may or may not know that in the beginning, when there were male doctors in the United States and elsewhere, they had very little or none of actual training. You could actually buy a degree or certificate saying you were an MD. You could follow another guy who didn't have very much education in medicine around for, a month or two, and then he'd give you a certificate. So it wasn't until 1910 that the Flexner Report, it's called, because Abraham Flexner was the person who went around to the few medical schools there were in the United States and saw how horrible they were. They set up a really much more stringent and valid accreditation system. Before that, medical schools were not accredited. Somebody could just, open one. And whatever they told you to do, you thought was real medicine. Well, it wasn't. So they had very little training. But in 1910, then they started getting licensed and they were investigated and certified and that type of thing. So, yeah, as you know, the doctors were mostly male. And many people didn't like male doctors and didn't like what they were doing or what they were prescribing. And so they continued going to women healers, even in the United States. And I don't know if you know this, but in the 15th and 16th century, they were called wise women often, the women healers, and they were healers and midwives, as I said, and they were burned at the stake just almost wholesale all over Europe as witches. So that got rid of a lot of them in Europe and the influence and power that they had in the culture in terms of healing. But even in later times, as we said, even in Europe and the US, women, people, but especially women, preferred female healers because, for one thing, they use gentler cures. Doctors at many of these points were doing their basic two cures were bloodletting, opening your veins and just letting a quote bad blood, go out into a basin, or purging, which gave you something to vomit and have diarrhea to get rid of whatever the bad stuff was. Both pretty miserable and killed, many people died from those quote treatments. So, of course, people still continued going to women healers who were using herbs and much more gentler forms. So, part of the reason, part of this had to do with what was called heroic medicine. And that was what the male doctors were practicing. As I just said, those heroic measures of bloodletting and purging and, that type of thing. And part of the reason that they used heroic medicine was to convince patients that it was worth the fees they were charging. I would add that that's very true today as well. You are often sold up for procedures in modern medicine. Okay, so just be conscious of that. Something very heroic to fix you, Female, and on top of that, female healers often didn't charge for their services. Historically, it was, bring them a basket of eggs or, whatever, something, in exchange, but not cash money. So therefore, the early doctors had to convince people to pay for services. Excuse me. To do that, they had to commodify healing. They had to turn it into something, a business that was bought and sold. So here's another book you really should read. It's called For Her Own Good, and it's by Barbara Ehrenreich, another wonderful author. The last territory that women claimed was childbirth. As recently as 1900, 50% of the babies in the US were delivered by midwives. Now, I want you to understand that currently, because I just looked this up before I put it in the lecture, okay? That's not old information. The percent of births in the US attended by midwives, currently, 4%. The percent of European births attended by midwives, 75%. The number of European countries, Great Britain, France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, all with over 75% midwife attended births, with higher perinatal deaths, mortality rates than in the US. 0. 75% of the births in those countries in industrialized modern Europe are attended by midwives, and and none of them have higher infant mortality rates than the United States, which has the highest infant mortality rate of any industrialized nation, any equivalent nation, and higher than many non-industrialized nations. Cuba, for example, is a very, very low infant mortality rate. Okay. Between 1900 and 1930, midwives were effectively eliminated in the United States, which made medicine, including women's medicine, a distinctly male profession for the next 30 to 40 years. And that's beginning to change now. I put up a link to a film or a piece of it called The Business of Being Born, which is about the American birth, medical industrialized birth process. And since we were talking about the 60s, or I was earlier, you know, many of us had our babies at home with midwives in the 60s. And there's another wonderful book I'll put up for you called Spiritual Midwifery by Ina May Gaskin. It was, she and her husband started a communal farm in Tennessee called The Farm. She had the lowest death rates, both maternal mortality and infant mortality rates anywhere in the United States, and it was all midwifery. So keep that all in mind. I'll stop promulgating stuff here, but it's important to understand that there, are other ways of thinking about these things, because this chapter is about our bodies and how they are acted upon and how we can gain autonomy over our bodies. But that takes knowledge and courage, both, and information. That's knowledge. Okay. Now, let's look at menopause in a cross-cultural perspective. Do you know that many, many, many cultures have no word for menopause? It's not a thing, but it sure has been commodified, hasn't it? Both in hormone replacement therapy and hysterectomies and a whole bunch of other things. So, but in the US, since the 1960s, the effects of menopause have been created or denoted as an actual disease. Okay. Now, however, HRT, hormone replacement therapy, large doses of estrogen were the treatment for years. But in the 1970s, research found a link between HRT and uterine cancer. So some doctors stopped using it, but it's still very, very common and prevalent, as you may know, with your mothers or a variety of other ways. So women in cultures that were not Anglo cultures, they don't necessarily mark menopause in any important ways, except relief in a lot of cultures. And as I said before, they don't even have a word to describe it in their language. So there's two very diverse cultures that this applies to, is both the Navajo people in our country and most Native American cultures in our country, and the Japanese. Okay. Now, there's lots of thoughts about the Japanese that one of the reasons, lots of research, that they don't have most of the symptoms that women complain about in the United States has a lot to do with diet. Anyway, so one researcher argued that the drug companies targeted women in menopause because they're more accessible through their doctors. as patients than men were, because women go to their gynecologists a lot more because of their, getting pregnant and a variety of other things than men see their doctors. So in other words, gynecology allowed drug companies to market HRT, hormone replacement therapy, easily and effectively to women. Now let's look at the sad story of eugenics, sterilization, and population control. This may be something you're not aware of. You may have learned about it in other classes, history, or a variety of things, but a lot of young people in America don't know about this history. So the struggle for reproductive self-determination, it's, one of the oldest in humanity. It's still going on today, isn't it? The struggle for reproductive self-determination, okay? The right to have children, for example, is not included in the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution. The right to found a family is, however, in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that if you want to form a family, that's a human right. So there's a very long history, as you're probably aware of attempts to control the reproduction of women and men in the United States into the 21st century. In kind of different ways, because what this section about is how is eugenics and how some people were not allowed to have children. So as opposed to people not having the option to not have children. So the word eugenics was coined from the Greek root meaning good race, as in a race of people. Eugenics came to mean the practice of improving the human race through selective breeding and restrictive immigration policies. Does that sound familiar? Okay. It developed in England over concerns about overpopulation among the lower classes. And too many of those damn Irish, peasants, stupid lower class people were coming to England during the Great Starvation in England, the potato famine, in Ireland. In the US, it was applied both to lower classes and, of course, racial minorities. It became a social movement involving large numbers of people in England and the US, and it was popular in the US in the early 20th century up to, the middle of the 20th century, actually. There were things like better baby contests. There's a certificate for that on page 238 in your text. The American Eugenics Society also advocated the use of newly developed IQ tests to determine who should and should not be allowed to reproduce. Where eugenicists gained influence, then involuntary sterilization, not voluntary, not like having your tubes tied or a vasectomy, that you choose, involuntary sterilization, forced sterilization, often became a legal practice and was used most often against women, of course. And you can read the story about Carrie Buck from 1923 in your text on page 239, who was sterilized and whose case wound up in the Supreme Court against her will. She was sterilized against her will. Her case wound up in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court upheld the right of a state to engage in forced eugenics sterilization. In 1928, 22 states had sterilization laws. As recently as the 1970s, the Indian Health Service doctors sterilized women, often without their consent or knowledge. If you are interested in that, once again, the internet, you could search about that, because it was not too long ago that there was a lot being written and disclosed about the Indian Health Service and sterilization just a few years ago. Because of this history, women around the world are very often suspicious of attempts to curb population. Can you understand why they would be? When people come with the best of intentions to try and distribute birth control pills or a variety of other things in many places around the world, people are suspicious of that because of this history. So we're going to end up with this little piece, the end of the chapter, called Throwing Like a Girl. So if you subscribe to the biosocial approach to gender, it's our bodies that give us gender. It's true that of course, there are some differences between male and females that are embedded in our bodies, like our hips. That's how they often tell with uh, corpses, skeletons, if it's male or female, is by the pelvis bones. So yes, of course there are some differences, but is it like throwing a ball part of that? Why do so many, but not all girls, obviously not everyone, throw differently than so many boys and men? Well, the answer is, and there's much more description of this in the text, so if you're interested, be sure you read everything that it says about this. I've shortened it up quite a bit. But the basic answer is that girls are far less likely to be taught how to throw a ball, and they're less motivated on their own to figure, to learn or ask someone to teach the athletic throwing on their own, because sports is such an important thing in that hegemonic masculinity for boys. Throwing is just one of the ways in which gender mediates the relationships that we have with our bodies. Gender impacts the things we can do with our bodies, like throwing a ball or walking down the street without fear. It dictates the way we feel about our bodies through body image and beauty myth. It also, as we've seen, influences the way we care for our bodies, as in the relationship between masculinity and health. And gender also dictates the amount of control we have over what is done to our bodies or what we can choose to do to our bodies in the case of hysterectomies and other reproductive rights. So in a very many diverse ways, our bodies are an important site for the complexities of gender in our everyday life, as this chapter demonstrated. Okay, Lukes, I finally finished my pooks. What a process, my pooks.